Welcome back to History with Richard. And today, wow, so much to get through. I'll try and keep it short, but you know I like to ramble. Today, we are going to have a truly epic episode. We're going to find out today why we say the phrase, draw a line in the sand. And as with many things in the English language, many things in the history of the world, the story is truly baffling and just truly enthralling, in my opinion. So if we remember back, if you haven't watched the previous episode, I'd recommend you do that now actually before we get into this one, because a lot of the stuff that I'll be talking about won't make much sense otherwise. Remember the name Francisco Pizarro. I mentioned him briefly in the previous episode. So we had Cortés conquering Mexico for the Spanish, and Pizarro, even though I never explicitly mentioned it, he was the guy who would conquer the great Inca in Cuzco and bring back, if we remember, all of that loot, gold, and especially silver from the mine of Potosi, which was in the Inca Empire and which is today in Bolivia. Remember the big mountain of silver. Today we're going to look at how Pizarro, or part of the story at least, of how Pizarro got there. And I'm going to try and not make the globe squeak this time. It's a bit annoying in the last audio file. If we remember, both Cortés and Pizarro were from the western interior of Spain, the province of Extremadura. Pizarro was actually illiterate. Both of them, Cortés was literate. He was quite a philosopher actually, a very complicated, a very strange man, both of them. Pizarro was a bit more of a simple man, a bit more of a grunt, and I don't think he ever learnt to read until sort of the end of his days. Also was never married, although I'm not sure if he ever had illegitimate children or anything like out of wedlock like that. I wouldn't be surprised. But think of Cortés as sort of this little more Napoleonic figure who struts around and thinks he's very sophisticated and intelligent. And Pizarro is more sort of knows who he is, really big guy, and is more of a physical bruiser, sort of like a bouncer outside of a nightclub who ends up conquering the Inca Empire of Peru. Very weird to think, but I think not that weird, because if we think about the fact that today, what would happen today if we were born into that situation? It's my belief that people don't really change very much throughout history, and I think the person who we know from our lives, who is the nightclub bouncer, or someone with a similar backstory to one of these guys, would have ended up, if the exact same scenario happened today, would have ended up being this person. So I think it's easy for us to sort of get in our own heads about figures from history being very different to us, and in many ways they are, because the cultures of that time were very different. Especially in Spain at the time, Catholicism was massive, and it still is actually in many parts of Spain, but we've got to remember that we're all human, we're all the same, Homo sapiens species. And a lot of these people who we are very critical of in history, rightly so, could just as well has been us in a different life. So I think that's always important to keep in mind. Anyway, we have Pizarro, who I termed the nightclub bouncer. He's from Extremadura in Spain. And he is the one who ends up conquering Peru. But before he does that, today we're not actually going to get to the conquest of Peru. We're mostly going to talk about how this line in the sand metaphor in the English language comes about. And it's actually from, I'm going to give away the ending here, it's from Pizarro. Let's set the context again. I don't know if I mentioned last time, but I think I was talking a lot about the Spanish Catholic kings Ferdinand and Isabella on the last episode. This episode, I want to focus on a different Spanish ruler who came to power in the early 1500s. There was sort of a bit of a succession struggle after both Isabella and Ferdinand died, and the guy to sort of come out of this, I think he's actually the grandson, or so he's not a sort of direct son of either of these two, but he rises to the top. His name is Carlos, and he is born into quite a fortune. So he is the Habsburg, the head of the House of Habsburg, which, if any of you remember your World War I history from school, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who gets assassinated in modern-day Bosnia, Sarajevo, is a Habsburg. Those people are still around. And so this guy was essentially, he wasn't the first Habsburg, but he was probably one of the most powerful Habsburgs ever. The Habsburgs traditionally are based out of Vienna, and somehow this guy, on top of being the head of the House of Habsburg, Charles, either called Charles I, Carlos is Spanish for Charles I or Charles V, depending on if you're talking from a Viennese perspective or a Spanish perspective. He was the first King Charles in Spain and the fifth King Charles of the Habsburgs. This guy, spending a lot of time on him, I know, but he's very important. So he was he was head of the House of Habsburg, which meant sort of he had a Central European kingdom through Vienna. He also was what was called at the time the Holy Roman Emperor. So he was essentially the head of the Catholic Church in Rome. And through his family, he was king of the Iberian Peninsula, king of Spain. Not actually sure if Portugal had broken off yet. I actually think it has by this point. But Charles I, or Charles V, let's call him Charles I for this episode, inherits a massive empire. And sort of by virtue of this empire being so big, I mean, big in European terms, right? It's not actually that big when we look at the world. He's got Spain, he's got not France, so France is a bit in his way, and then he's got sort of, above Italy, where Austria, Hungary and stuff is where the seat of the Habsburgs. So naturally, just again, we can learn a lot from geography. In between his two main sort of areas of land, he's got France. And Charles I and the King of France at the time, who I think was called Francis, of the House of Valois. So we have this massive tussle between the Habsburgs and the Valois, and this will go on for quite a while. But Charles and Francis are not mates at all. They hate each other. They're rivals. Two bullies on the block, and they both want to come out on top. And they fight each other for ages, right? So because, what was I saying before? Charles I of Spain, Charles V, same guy, of the Habsburgs, his lands are sort of split with France in the middle. So he really wants to consolidate his power and get rid of these like annoying French guys. So he fights pretty much for the entirety of his reign. He's king for a long time, about 40 or 50 years. He will fight France for most of that time. He will also fight, remember, we're in the 1500s now. And if you remember back to my first episode, who conquers Constantinople, modern day Istanbul, in 1453? The Ottoman Empire. Sort of like the descendants or the next iteration of the Mongols, right? With some differences. The Mongols turned out to be or converted to Islam as well, but the Turks or the Ottomans were quite a force. And in Charles I's lifetime, during his reign, there will be Ottoman forces outside Vienna. So we've got Istanbul here. Vienna is all the way over there. The Ottomans almost take Vienna, and they very nearly do. All this is to say that Charles I is fighting the French, I want you to remember that, and he's fighting the Ottomans the entire time because of the nature of Europe, the nature of the Mediterranean, the nature of the fertility of the soil, the fact that there are always empires sort of going at it. We've had the Roman Empire dominant, we've had sort of the Persian Empire before trying to be dominant in the area, and now there's just a squabble. And this will continue for, up until our lifetime today. So we've got France he's fighting, the Ottomans he's fighting, And I also want you to remember, I'm not going to mention it again this episode, but it will be important for future ones. Charles I, who is a Catholic, remember, he's the Holy Roman Emperor, the seat in Rome, is also fighting the bloody Lutherans in Germany, the Protestants. So the Protestants are trying to break away from the Christian church, and Charles, who's the Holy Roman Emperor, wants to have sort of unity in his lands, doesn't like that at all. And this means wars on 3 fronts, means that he is constantly spending, shit tons of money, shit tons of silver and gold. And where's he getting that? Luckily for him, he's got sort of an untapped resource here, which is sort of horrible to say now because we know what that involved, but he is just dredging the Americas of all its mineral wealth, all its gold and silver, remember mainly silver, and he's using it in Spain to fight a bunch of wars with his rival European monarchs. And so Pizarro is sort of caught up in the middle of this. He's an Extremaduran peasant. He's nowhere near sort of the royal family or the royal house, but he knows if he goes over to the New World and makes a fortune, he's going to be useful to the king. This is what a lot of these guys were thinking at the time. There's wars going on. Do I want to stay and fight in the war? That's one option. Or do I go and procure the gold so that other people can fight the war? That's putting it into simple terms. The people who ended up going to the New World were fighting all the time anyway. So it was, stuck between a rock and a hard place there. I don't know what I would have done at the time. It was a fairly brutal world then. I think I just would have died at some point early on in my life, maybe of starvation or something. But if I had the chance, sort of military training, would I have fought for, a war in Europe or gone to the New World? I honestly don't know. I think it all depends on sort of the health of your family members, whether you're orphaned and stuff like that. But it's quite interesting to think what you would have done in that situation. And remember, this is almost everything I'm talking about here is from the male perspective. History often is written from, just accounts of men, and often we miss the female perspective. So, and I'll try and weave that in, more and more into our stories. Last episode, we talked about one of the slave girls that Cortez captured in Mexico, who I called Maschilda. I'm pretty sure I've pronounced that right. And yeah, I'll try and make sure that we sort of don't just focus on the men all the time. Again, we've set the scene now a bit with Pizarro, who is on this sort of treasure hunt for gold. Cortez has already struck, a massive blow. He's been the first to grab the Aztecs, all the wealth of the Aztecs and the Mayans. And Pizarro thinks, I've heard about this Inca civilization. I want to go at that. And he finds it really difficult actually to convince people, the people in power. Remember, he's just a grunt, a nightclub bouncer who's good at wielding a sword and shooting a gun. He finds it hard to convince the people in power to send him men. So he's somewhere here on the sort of the North Ecuadorian coast, and he's sitting on this island, and the governor of Panama just isn't sending him any men. I think a really important thing that I should note here that I forgot to mention in the last episode is, remember how the Spanish, remember this was only 20 years ago that the Spanish, this is about 1530-ish, the Spanish in 1510 or around about there came to Panama for the first time, and they realized, so all of Spanish shipping, right, was in this area. There was no Spanish ship on this side, on the Pacific side. They had to cross the little land bridge here in Panama. And I sort of nonchalantly said last time, well, they crossed the isthmus and then started sailing ships on the other side. And I sort of made it sound like they were carrying their ships across the land bridge. Now that's ridiculous because if you just look at a map of Panama, you realize the whole place is full of mountains. There is no way that you can transport much across there. So what they did, rather extraordinarily, I think, is, remember, this is like malaria-infested, really strenuous terrain to get through unless you're a local. They somehow carried their iron nails, the Spanish that is, and Again, very dark undertones here because they forced a lot of indigenous people to carry the stuff for them. Their iron nails, their ship's anchors, and their metal chains that I'm sure they used to chain up locals as well. Again, very disturbing detail, but it's true. They dragged all this stuff over these mountains, over this hospitable terrain to the Pacific side of Panama. And on that side, they had to construct new ships, right? So they had all their ships on the Atlantic, and a bunch of people crossed the Isthmus of Panama and had to build new European-style ships on the other side. I just think I should highlight that because it's a very impressive thing to be able to do, and it takes an enormous amount of work, and I just sort of glossed over it last time. So within 20 years, they had quite a few ships already. Panama City was already sort of had a Spanish governor at the time, and Pizarro is sitting here in Ecuador, and he wants to go south to essentially go and loot a bunch of Inca treasure. And the Panama governor isn't letting him. He's not convinced by this venture. And so now we circle back to the line in the sand story. There's one point where Pizarro and 12 others, these are very famous in Spanish history as the pioneering 13, but I think they're just a bunch of greedy treasure hunters, in my opinion. I'm sure there's a bit more nuance. And one of them is actually a Greek, this massive Greek guy from Crete. But anyway, these 12 guys are sitting on an island, essentially stranded here in northern Ecuador. And the Spanish from Panama send a ship. They've essentially left these guys here to sort of stew and say, look, we're not going to support your mission. Essentially, we don't care if you guys die on this island. We can't really be bothered with you. We're not going to send you more men. We're not going to send you ships to go south. And Pizarro is getting sort of weaker by the day. They're running out of water on this island. There's not much food. And here comes a Spanish ship. And the guy on the ship tells them, look, just come back now. Sort of, you've had enough. Stop being, so bloody-minded, pig-headed. Just come back to Panama and, come and work. Just stop being annoying. And Pizarro stands there, just imagining him with sort of his clothes falling off his body, skinny, very, very annoyed, very up himself. And he takes out his sword, and they're standing on the beach. He draws a line in the sand. This is literally where this saying comes from. And he says, listen, you guys, to the guys behind him, the 12 guys behind him, if you want to go back to Panama, be my guest. But know that sort of I'm going to look at you for the rest of your life as cowards and lickspittles. If you stay with me, I guarantee you, we will go and we will be conquerors. Isn't that crazy that I've used that term so many times in my life, and I have no idea that it comes back to this random Spanish treasure hunter who was mad on sort of the high of funding a bunch of European wars, who wanted to go raid the Incas of all their gold and silver. Crazy. You've probably seen that I've gotten quite excited in this episode. I don't know if it was easy to follow all of that, but I just think history is so full of remarkable stories, and we'll pick this up in the next one, of how Pizarro, after he's drawn his line in the sand and convinced some people, I'm going to keep being stubborn, eventually he convinces one ship, I think it's this same ship actually, so he eventually gets on the ship, and he just tells the captain, can you please just go south for, one day? We just want to see what's around the next headland. And that is where everything changes. See you in the next one, and stay curious.